Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real Story Group's webinar today, How to Get to WCM 4.0. I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group. Love this topic. Have to say it's a little bit bittersweet for me personally. You'll see in a moment, I've been following this field for a long time, and the real story on the next phase of WCM is that it's going to downshift a little bit. It's going to get simpler, which is good. But it's also going to narrow in scope and honestly become relatively a little bit less important in your stack. That in the long run, again, is a good thing for you, maybe not for the marketplace as a whole. But it's really important to understand these trends. So I'd like to spend the next half hour with you. We won't need the full half hour for the presentation. So if you have any questions at all, anything you disagree with, anything you just want to share as a comment, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll definitely have enough time at the end to get to that. In the meantime, if you're wondering whether you're going to get a copy of this deck, the answer is yes, you will get it in the next 24 to 48 hours. If you are a Real Story Group subscriber, you will also have in your library the full recording of this webinar, which you can share with your other colleagues at work. All right, so with that done, let's get into it. Those of you who know us know we're a different kind of analyst firm. We're making fun of the Gartner Magic Quadrant on the left because I originally founded Real Story Group. It was the original name some 25 years ago was CMS Watch. We just evaluated web content management systems. And it was in reaction to some of the traditional analyst firms like Forrester and Gartner that we thought were really putting out these kind of bullshit analyses that had nothing to do with those of us who actually had to implement these tools. Unfortunately, that pattern persists. Real Story Group is kind of an antidote for that. We changed our name from CMS Watch to Real Story Group when we started covering other technologies across the digital experience and MarTech stack. But still, personally for me, kind of coming up in the CMS world, this is always a favorite topic of mine. But this covers all the different segments, this vendor map, which is kind of based on loosely on kind of a subway map, transit map, tube map, where all the different technologies are represented as different colored lines. This represents all the different technologies that we cover here at Real Story Group. This map is going to change next month when we add agents to this, which will be a really interesting new line on this map. But the oldest line, as I mentioned, is the light blue line, and that's for web content and experience management. And it's always been about web content and experience management. So when I say WCM, you could also think WCXM. Still a lot of vendors in this space. And so it is a highly fragmented marketplace. No major vendor has dominated this space, although many have tried. And so that means you have a lot of choices, and a lot of choice is good, but there's also a lot of differences about where the vendors are at. And now we have kind of a new methodology of charting all of that. So as always, in the 2020s, we need to be thinking not just about individual tool sets, but what's the broader stack look like? And so we have a stack model that is partly descriptive and partly aspirational that I'm going to talk about, and then try to nestle what is WCM fit, within that broader context. So in the 2000s, when we first started CMS Watch, this was our reference model. It was a CMS that had editorial workflows, business rules. It was also kind of a library, and you had all this content that you threw into it, and then it tossed out content, mostly web pages. But even back then, there was this notion of multi-channel publishing to PDF, to wireless devices, syndication, so on and so forth. So even the first CMSs were multi-channel, but they were really just kind of multi-channel inbound digital, and that's still very much sort of their role in the stack. In the 2010s, this all changed with the expansion of different channels, social, email, mobile, increasingly digital video, all these production and interaction delivery services, and then many of us investing very heavily in these colored boxes here: digital asset management, web content management, marketing automation, social engagement, some customer data soup underneath it that may or may not, usually wasn't well connected. And so we beefed up these four kind of silos here and tried to integrate sort of horizontally. That didn't work very well. And moreover, web content management vendors found that they could only make a limited amount of money actually selling web content management. So they acquired a bunch of sort of adjacent tools and came up with this phrase called DXP. This was actually originated in the analyst world and was originally designed to kind of revivify the dying enterprise portals marketplace. So it was the portals who first started calling themselves DXP, but then the Web CMS vendors popped up and said, well, we're a DXP too, which could mean any number of different things, but usually was a very heterogeneous collection of acquired tools that typically didn't work well together, sold as kind of a coherent platform, and Gartner and others pushing this very heavily. And you know that that whole story was bullshit from the very beginning, and that none of these were actually coherent platforms. And it's basically a failed strategy. And we'll see how it's really failing in the next couple of years. But even back in 2017, when we were looking at this, it was pretty clear this was a myth. I'll show you the Forrester wave on the left and the Gartner quadrant on the right, and you may not be able to see these very well, but even back in 2017, it was just a total cornucopia of different tools: e-commerce, digital asset management, social platforms, web content management, portals, all kind of thrown in together, and that was no way to buy software. The good news is, at least among major enterprises, is that for the most part, they avoided this whole strategy. In other words, the stack today in almost every large enterprise is not a vendor-specific stack. The composable stack model has totally won out. We've got data behind this we can share with you, certainly examples from our own council and others that show that the composable stack model, not the DXP model, has really won out. So what does this model look like? This is our MarTech and digital reference architecture for the 2020s. This is partly a description of what's going on and partly a description of where we think particularly larger enterprises should be going, where again, you have this profusion of engagement channels across the top, different interaction delivery environments, then a wide variety of engagement services. These are the first row of colored boxes there, where again, we've been beefing up in these silos, and a lot of these silos had their own captive data, their own captive content, and their own captive kind of personalization logic and that sort of thing. And that is just not working in the omni-channel world. We have all this spaghetti integration, and where we think the future lies and where smarter enterprises are going is investing in what we call these content foundation services. And so there's three legs to this stool: content and information over on your left, data in the middle, where we've seen a lot of activity, particularly around CDPs and other investments, and then decisioning, which is probably the least mature of all of these, particularly in an omni-channel context. But we also tend to think that this is also where AI is going to be living, is going to be as a foundation layer rather than popping up in all these different places. So you'll have generative AI, insights AI, and decisioning AI as kind of customer foundation services. This is a very, very different model from what we've been working on and trying to perfect in the 2010s. And it means a number of different things. Most specifically, the scope of what you're going to need in these engagement services is going to get lighter, because instead of being decision makers, they're going to be more order takers, getting their key content and data and services from external, more omni-channel, more decoupled services that lie underneath them. And specifically with respect to web content management, it means that a couple things. First of all, web content management and your inbound website, for that matter, are still important, but in relative terms across all the customer touch points, it's less important than it used to be, simply because you have all these other touch points that you need to invest in. But also, the winning solutions here are going to be having a lighter, more narrowly scoped web content management tier, because it's going to be essentially ingesting and aggregating services from a number of other places that are managed in a more channel neutral way. So you never want your web content management system, or for that matter, any of these engagement services, to be a core service that is across all of your channels, because it's living within a channel, and that again means horizontal integration, and they were never designed for that. So that's kind of the architectural view that is hinting at a narrower scope for web content management, both from a functional standpoint, but also, we have to admit, from a relative standpoint in terms of the importance of it with respect to what does customer success mean. And so that means that if you're smart about this and you're future looking, then you want to get lighter here at a time when many major vendors, including Adobe and others, are actually sort of pushing you to get heavier at this layer. So this is what we call a legless architecture. So the legs of these engagement services, the three legs of this stool, come from your enterprise foundation services. And that's where a lot of the complexity is moving, where more people resources are being applied. And frankly, we're seeing more budget being applied there as well. And our theory here, which is I think bearing out among some of the savvier enterprises we work with, is that this is the only way you get to speed and scale. Definitely the only way to get to omni-channel. And maybe most importantly, this is the only way to do effective AI, because AI wants you to have these core enterprise foundation services to work off of. And in fact, that's probably what's going to differentiate you in the AI world. So this is both a trend and we think an aspiration, particularly if you're a larger enterprise. Now, if you're more in the mid-market, it's potentially a different story, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But this is sort of what's happening at an architectural level. And so now we can think about, okay, well, what does this mean then for web content management? And so that's what you're all here for, and let's talk about that. First of all, let's all agree, hopefully, that the story on headless is now closed. That from an architectural perspective, most organizations want hybrid headless. In other words, you have certain use cases where you want to do top-down page curation, and there's other use cases where you want more bottom-up content assembly. And the reality is that the typical large enterprise needs both, which is another way of saying that headless is not an architecture or a way of life, it's simply a feature. And so going with a headless only vendor is likely to be a dark alley for you. Certainly has been a dark alley for many of the organizations who have done that without necessarily checking out the full scope of the use cases that they want. Another way of putting this is headless is a feature, legless is an architecture. We'll come back to that a little bit later. The other thing that's important to understand here is, of course, what is AI doing in this whole world? And we've spent other webinars on this that you can check out. Some of them are publicly available. We're going to be doing more webinars on this topic going forward. This is our generic kind of reference model that we've been working with our clients on to customize for their use cases. There's a lot to say here. The first thing I'll say is that across all these different diverse engagement services, AI is just kind of showing up. All the vendors are just popping them in. For a small, mid-sized business, that might be okay. For experimenting. For a larger enterprise, you have the burden of responsible AI, which is foundations, governance, transparency, cost control is a really big one. So you really need to think twice about lighting this stuff up, and you're probably going to want to think about AI more as a layer. That's something that's more controlled, and then you can have freedom within a framework. So that's the first thing to say about that. The second thing is that AI is really best understood in terms of use cases. So there are some core use cases that you're going to want to prioritize here, and we've been working with some enterprises in terms of developing their strategy. And so it should be use case driven rather than availability driven. Agents are going to change the picture on this and are largely going to be contingent on how mature you are in your broader AI strategy. Agents is not give you an opportunity to somehow leapfrog over some core AI capabilities that you need. Also, generative AI is likely to be downstream from insights and decisioning AI, which means, among other things, that there are web content management vendors that are looking for some angle, some way of still being relevant, and they're trying to do this with generative AI. The reality is that your web content management platform might not be the right place to do a lot of generative AI, and moreover, it's not going to necessarily be driven by logic that's happening within your web content management platform. That for always on AI, the generative AI capabilities you're going to need are going to be because some insights were made, you made some decisions about who's to get it, and then you're driving some generative. And the key thing here, again, is these foundational platforms that you need. And we'll talk in particular about this notion of an omni-channel content platform, a kind of enterprise content component platform, that's going to be really critical to your future AI strategy. So all this is, again, really pointing out that AI itself doesn't necessarily change the inexorable trends that are happening within the web content management industry. It's not that they're making web content management platforms obsolete, it's just that it's unlikely to be a differentiator, and it's unlikely to be really decisive in terms of the kind of change that we're recommending here shortly that you really need to be making. So let's talk about this red box that we had in the customer foundation base. We call this an omni-channel content platform. This is a spin-off from the digital asset management environment marketplace, but it's a very special kind of spin-off. These are more object-oriented platforms, typically with a graph model where assets, traditional image and video assets and voice, as well as text, as well as data presenting as content, they're all first-class objects. So you can mix and match them in a broader graph framework, includes traffic tracking and mechanisms, tracking and measurement, so you can begin to understand the impact of this content. It's critical for generative AI. This is a kind of an emerging trend. This has been an emerging trend since this kind of first came out about 7 or 8 years ago. It's just within the last year that we've seen much more significant adoption of this as the enterprise component store for a large enterprise where their reusable content or the content that they want to derive channel specific variants for, it all starts here. This is essentially the content engine, and it's the most important content that you're going to want to have. And this is where the center of gravity for a lot of your content management is going to continue. And so in this world where you have your enterprise content, your digital asset management, product information, other things in this omni-channel content platform where everything is graphed out, it's reusable, it's derivable, you can push it to all these different channels. In that world, what's the scope of web content management? Well, it's longer form experiential or story-based content that might be web-specific content. Doing page curation, so if you want to do some kind of page assembly in a manual, human curated way. And the other thing is dynamic experience assembly. In other words, where you're using your web content management system to mix and match application components and content components and do that in a more declarative way as opposed to a fully automated way. That's really the future of WCM, which is much lighter than it serves today, at least for larger enterprises. Again, we'll talk about the mid-market. So the market is evolving. So this is our traditional view at the marketplace still stands that this is a very mature market. And in mature markets, you typically divide on a kind of a complexity spectrum. In other words, you have simpler to more advanced. The simpler end of the web content management market now has been taken over by page builders like Wix and Squarespace. So we're really talking about toolkits, of which there's only one left, which is Adobe, down to mid-range platforms, which are just slightly simpler and less expensive than the upper range. So the marketplace has gotten compressed a little bit. There's a lot of intense competition, which is good for you. I think as an industry, we have discovered that the toolkit model, for a variety of reasons, was kind of a failure. I think Sitecore has pretty much admitted that. Optimizely is going to have to admit that at some point. That it was part and parcel of this whole sort of DXP strategy as well. But the market is still highly fragmented, and the upper range is interesting because those vendors are definitely under some threat. We call those 3.0 vendors, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The mid-range, still a lot of useful, powerful players there. You could probably add a dozen more if you included regional and other sort of platforms. These are the ones that we get the most inquiries on here at Real Story Group. So this is still a valid way of looking at the market. Now, if you're going to get simpler at the engagement tier, just right off the bat, you can look at platforms like Contentful, Sitecore, Optimizely, Acquia, Adobe. These are developer-intensive platforms. And part of what you should be looking at is the opportunity to maybe get simpler in this future world where you've decoupled a lot of advanced services and you really want to move faster and not have these 6 to 12 week SDLC life cycles on what should be a fairly simple front-end website, particularly in this age where it's going to be more agents visiting your website than humans. Again, the case for these heavyweight content management systems really kind of falls apart a little bit there. So what does the future then look like? And we think there's this future called WCM 4.0. This is a new chart for us. Welcome your feedback on it. We're looking at the evolution of WCM platforms. So this looks like it's kind of a linear progression. In fact, what's happening here is there are different use cases that can actually coexist. So we start with first the page publisher paradigm, which is how all WCM tools sort of started. And there's still a use case for that, particularly in media, for SEO or AEO pages. Then came the content catalog, which was essentially a catalog of structured content that was not necessarily assigned to a particular page, but could be dynamically invoked. Drupal was probably the first and best example of that, and then many others followed. Then a lot of large enterprises really kind of fell into a trap at level 3, which was to turn their website into a customizable application, and it ended up in many cases becoming just too heavy and honestly too expensive. We think level 4 is going to have a lower level of effort, potentially offering similar value, but with kind of a different scope, and we call it an inbound experience director. So for your inbound experiences, to the extent that you want a director, which will probably have a mix of AI and human logic, a mix of content, data, and decisioning coming from a variety of different places. I won't call this a portal because it's not necessarily a portal, but this is really where we're going. Now that inbound experience director will also need lightweight content management but mostly for web specific content. So we're probably talking long form content, blogs, longer case studies, that sort of thing, where you're not necessarily needing to reuse or repurpose or derive that content across different channels. So this is a more detailed description. I think I'll pass on reading this all out to you because you're going to get a copy of this deck anyway. But this, sort of describes the progression and what's going on. And so I'll just identify a couple key points in each one. First, I guess the last bullet here, that page publisher is still a legitimate model for many enterprises and certainly the default model for many media companies. So by calling it Web WCM 1.0, I'm not trying to dismiss it as somehow immature there. That's just kind of where web content management systems started. Content catalog, this allows for placeless content that's assembled and delivered dynamically. This is really the use case that a lot of headless CMS vendors targeted. The problem with the headless CMS vendors is they don't really treat data and image assets as first-class objects, and they typically don't have a graph model, and so that's why they never became the OCP of the future. Then we got the WCM 3.0, which seemed very sophisticated, very rich, but didn't necessarily drive a lot of value. We've learned that just personalizing content for its own sake sometimes has even a negative ROI. And so the big hurdle here is as the bottom thing that we're pointing out here. Sophisticated page components require formal SDLC process for updates and enhancements. And if you're a marketer, that should scare you. The inbound experience manager, I'm not going to suggest that this transition is going to be easy or simple or fast, but the notion here is that your web content management over time becomes more of an experience aggregator and manager for inbound traffic, leveraging components from multiple different systems. And it's going to be a lighter platform that emphasizes order taking over decision making. May still manage channel specific long form content. Some of the human elements of this ultimately will probably be hand over to human in the loop or human on the loop AI capabilities, whether they're agentic or not, but that's likely the future. So what if we do this fun exercise then and start putting vendors next to these buckets? So page publisher, still WordPress, Progress, Sitefinity, two high quality platforms that fit that bill very effectively. Content catalog, again, there's some newer vendors here, but this is effectively what they're doing. The headless vendors certainly fit in this category. Then this notion of a customizable application, which seemed like it could deliver a lot of rich experiences and sometimes did. The question I think that we're all asking is, was that leap really worth it? And the answer that we're increasingly getting back is no. And then, as far as the inbound experience director, we have some thoughts about vendors that are heading there or are there. I invite you to contact your Real Story Group rep, and we can chat in a little bit more detail about that. That's a little bit more of a interesting kind of provisional sort of answer that we'd be happy to give you offline after some conversation about where you're at. Now, there is a different story at the small and mid-sized environment, and that is what we call a site in a box. And these platforms have been site in a boxes for some time. where they either internally or externally through modules or plugins, they have capabilities like SEO, forums, comments, polls, caching, chatbots, A/B testing, site search, then getting on into even Gen AI plugins, forms, newsletters, registration, and a lot more, right? And so this model is still an effective model for a firm that doesn't want to do all this stuff best of breed. The one thing though, when we start getting into AI forms, newsletters, registration, is that there's some potential stack overlap there, that those are more sort of marketing things that often then relate also to customer data and other services that tend to be, the web content management system often wants to manage more externally. And so that's where there's potential stack overlap. So there's a lot of value to this model of a site in a box. The problem is that it doesn't have this notion of omni-channel content components that live and can be extended across your whole stack. It's a lot of content and services that are stuck in your web channel. So your web channel better be you know, where the majority of your customer interactions are happening. So there's pros and cons to this story. All right. So once again, I'll invite you, if you have any questions or concerns, or something you want to disagree with or agree with, or an example you want to give, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. But let's wrap this up. So key takeaways here: scope of web content management is narrowing, especially in the enterprise tier. So that's reducing its relative importance in the overall MarTech DX stack. That's not necessarily bad news. It might be bad news for the vendors. I think it's good news for you. The future of web content management is going to be more around inbound page and experience assembly, maybe supporting content management for one-off or long-form web content. Advanced features like personalization, digital asset management, all things, those are all going to get externalized. And what that means then is your web content management system has to play more nicely in your stack than ever. And so that's one of the issues that we have with like Optimizely, Adobe, and some others, Acquia. So there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for enterprise to simplify your WCM investment. So simple means less expensive and faster. And particularly if you like faster, there's real value there. We're seeing some evidence of this. Organizations that are getting out of some of the shackles of their Web 3.0 platforms. We think that the long descent of Sitecore XP, so that's the traditional single tenant on-premise model of Sitecore, its flagship web content management system. They keep extending the life of it because people don't want to get off it. But it is on a descent. Everybody knows it's on a descent, and that's really the canary in the coal mine that Sitecore was really unable to come up with a successor to that. That supposedly their XM Cloud is. Really, it's just kind of a dumbed down version of XP that kind of sort of works. And so, you know, this is, I think, a canary in the coal mine in terms of the failure of that whole tier of web content management services. Again, the mid-market story is we'll see some more continuity, that this site in the box CMS will persist, albeit with some stack overlaps. It's not going to deliver what an OCP can, but maybe you're not sophisticated enough as an organization, or you don't have the resources to really go that sort of route. So again, some of the conclusions for this: DXP is even more of a dead end than it ever was, and it is a good time to reconsider your dev-heavy CMS. I think that's probably the single biggest meta story here. It is a good time to reconsider your dev-heavy CMS. In terms of next steps, welcome to get in touch with us by email, on LinkedIn. You can download a free sample of any of our hard-hitting vendor evaluation research. If you want to talk about a full stack subscription that gets you access to everything and allows us to apply our stack model to help you generate future roadmaps, definitely let us know. We also have an exclusive customer-only council of large enterprise MarTech leaders, and you can go to our site and see a lot of interesting insights that they've had. And if you want to join that Insiders Club, just reach out to us. In the meantime, some questions have arisen. Let's see, Eric is asking, where is Magnolia in this 4 phases? Yeah, so Magnolia is interesting. I think that because they play nicely in the stack and because it can be, the platform can be somewhat composed, that it has good potential for being this hybrid headless Web 4.0 type solution, also because it tends to be less expensive to license and manage. Time will tell whether the company fully goes in that direction. But I think it was a strategic win for them to avoid the whole DXP thing. Let's see. Eliza is asking, where is Microsoft in all this? Well, Microsoft is AWOL. They've been AWOL for a while. In our chart, you saw them grayed out along with IBM and OpenText and Oracle and some others who have essentially vacated this space, really focusing on more kind of intra-enterprise and to some extent intranet file management rather than public-facing web content management. Okay, so that takes us a couple minutes past the half hour. Great to be here again with you all. You can check out our website. We've got some interesting webinars coming up next around optimizing your MarTech stack, about the agentic AI marketplace, about benchmarking your AI services, and also lessons, career lessons for MarTech leaders. So some good stuff coming up. You can go to our website and look under about, and then sign up for any webinars that tickle your fancy there. So until next time, this is Tony Byrne saying so long for now.